Grace Tolliver signed her name to the marriage paper with a hand that did not shake, though everything else about her did, because the man she was marrying lay propped on pillows not 6 feet away, too weak to stand for his own wedding, and the preacher reading the vows kept glancing at him, as though expecting the ceremony to end in a funeral rather than a marriage. "Do you, Ambrose Wexley," the preacher said, "take this woman?" "I do," Ambrose said, before the sentence was finished, in a voice worn thin as old rope but steady enough. And Grace looked at him gray-faced, hollow-eyed, dying by every account the doctor had given the town, and understood that she had just tied her whole future to a man 3 physicians had already given up on. The parlor at Lone Pine smelled of camphor and beeswax candles, and the particular staleness of a sickroom too long shut against fresh air. And Grace, standing in a borrowed dress that did not quite fit and reciting vows to a man she had met exactly once before, found herself thinking, with the strange detachment of a person watching her own life from some slight distance, that she had imagined her wedding day 100 different ways as a girl, and none of them had looked anything like this. There was no music. There was no gathered family, her own having dwindled to no one at all in the 18 months since her father's death. There was only the preacher's careful, funeral-quiet voice, and a dying stranger's steady eyes, and her own resolve, hardening with each word of the ceremony into something she did not yet have a name for. She had not come to Lone Pine for love. She had come because her father had died owing more than his small farm was worth, because the bank had taken the house over her head within a month of the funeral, because she had exactly $11 to her name, and a lifetime's practice at hard work, and no other offer in the world that did not involve considerably worse bargains than nursing a dying man in exchange for the roof over her head, and, should he live long enough to make it legal, a widow's claim on his land after. "I don't ask you to love me," Ambrose had told her plainly, the one time they'd met before the wedding, in a parlor that smelled of medicine and defeat. "I ask only that you nurse me as decently as a wife might, for however long I've got left, and that you'll have this ranch clear when I'm gone, rather than let it fall to a nephew who's already measuring the drapes for his own taste. The doctors give me weeks. I'd rather spend what's left of them married to a woman of sense than alone, with only my own dying company." "And if I find I can't stomach the arrangement," Grace had asked, "once I've seen the whole of what it requires?" "Then you'll leave with the land signed over regardless," Ambrose had said, "because I'll not have it said I bought a wife's care with false promises. You're free to go the moment it costs you more than you're willing to pay. I only hope, for both our sakes, it doesn't come to that." She had looked at him a long moment, this ailing stranger offering her security in exchange for nothing crueler than honest work, and had thought of her father's slow decline the winter before, of the fever that had taken him inch by inch while she sat helpless at his bedside, learning far more about the stubborn mechanics of the body's fight against death than any respectable young woman was generally taught, and had said yes before she'd fully decided to, because some instinct in her recognized, even then, that this was a fight she had already trained half a lifetime for without knowing it. Her father had been a proud man, a failed farmer who had borrowed against seed and rain that never came in equal measure, and Grace had nursed him through that final winter with a devotion that had earned her nothing in the end but a debt collector's visit within a week of the burial, and a banknote that swallowed the only home she'd ever known. She remembered, still, the particular helplessness of watching a body fail by degrees, while every remedy she tried bought only borrowed hours rather than a cure. And she remembered, too, the fierce, useless anger she had felt afterward, not at her father's dying, but at her own inexperience, at every hour she had spent guessing instead of knowing what his body needed. She had promised herself, kneeling at his grave in a wind that cut straight through her one good coat, that she would never again sit so helpless at a sickbed for want of skill she might have learned in time. She had not expected that promise to deliver her, less than 2 years later, into another sick room entirely, with another dying man's life set square in her two hands. But she recognized the shape of the chance when it arrived, and took it. Dr. Alderson came the morning after the wedding to check on his patient and found, instead of the compliant, grieving young bride he'd expected, a new Mrs. Wexley already elbow-deep in reorganizing the sick room, airing the stale linens, and asking pointed questions about the exact dosage and timing of every medicine in the house. "Mrs. Wexley," Alderson said, not unkindly but with the weary patience of a man who had delivered this particular verdict many times before, "I don't say this to be unkind, but you ought to understand plainly what you've married into. Mr. Wexley's heart has been failing since spring. His lungs fill with fluid faster than any tonic I've got can clear them. I give him, generously, 6 weeks. I'd not have you exhaust yourself fighting a battle medicine's already lost." 6 weeks is considerably longer than any day now, which is what the town's been saying since I arrived, Grace said, not looking up from the linen she was folding. "I intend to make good use of every one of those 6 weeks, doctor, and I'd be obliged if you teach me what you know rather than simply pronouncing sentence and riding off to your next patient." Alderson studied her a moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, not quite hope. He had learned long ago not to indulge that particular luxury on a dying man's behalf, but a flicker of professional curiosity he hadn't expected to feel again so soon. "Very well," he said. "I'll teach you what I know. Whether it changes the outcome is beyond either of our controlling, but I've rarely met a nurse with your particular stubbornness, and stubbornness has surprised me before." The first weeks settled into a rhythm that Grace built with the same careful, unglamorous persistence she'd once brought to nursing her own father, propping Ambrose upright through the worst of his breathing spells, so the fluid in his lungs had less chance to pool, steaming bitter herbs beneath a tent of blankets to ease his coughing, forcing broth and water past his reluctance a spoonful at a time, keeping careful count of every good hour and bad one in a ledger she'd begun without quite deciding to. The first real test came on the 9th night, when Ambrose woke past midnight fighting for breath, in a way that sent Grace's heart into her throat before her training could steady her hands. She propped him upright against every pillow the house owned, steeped the bitter herbs Alderson had left with careful instruction, and sat with her palm flat against his back through an hour of ragged, rattling breath that tested every ounce of the calm she had learned, at her father's bedside, to wear like armor regardless of what she felt underneath it. "You're allowed to be afraid," Ambrose managed, between labored breaths, watching her steady hands with an attention that missed very little even at his weakest. "You needn't perform composure for my benefit alone, Grace." "I'm not performing it for your benefit," Grace said, adjusting the steam tent with hands that did not shake though her chest had gone tight with fear. "I'm performing it for my own. A frightened nurse makes mistakes a calm one doesn't, and I've buried one patient already for want of steadier nerves than I had at the time. I'll not repeat the failure with you." His breathing eased, by slow degrees, toward dawn, and when he finally slept, she sat a while longer in the gray early light simply watching the rise and fall of his chest, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that the fear she'd kept so carefully hidden from him had not been only professional. Ambrose, for his part, proved considerably better company than a dying man had any obligation to be. He had, beneath the illness wasting his body, a dry, patient wit that surfaced more often as the weeks wore past his doctor's first prediction, and a habit of watching Grace work with an attention that had less to do. She began to notice, with monitoring his own care, and more to do with simple, unhurried appreciation of the woman doing it. "You didn't marry a corpse after all," he told her one evening, 3 weeks in, his color better than it had been at the wedding though still far from healthy. "I confess I expected to have made you a widow well before now. I've never been overly fond of following other people's schedules," Grace said, adjusting his pillows with the brisk efficiency she'd have used on any patient, though something in her chest had gone unexpectedly warm at the sight of his improved color. "You'll die when your body decides to, and not 1 hour sooner, Ambrose Wexley, and I intend to keep arguing with it on your behalf for as long as it's willing to listen." "A remarkable attitude for a woman who married me purely for the land," he said, watching her with an expression she was beginning to find difficult to look away from. "I married you for the land," Grace agreed. "I find myself nursing you, increasingly, for reasons that have considerably less to do with the deed." It was into this fragile, improving peace that Caspar Wexley rode, 3 weeks after the wedding, with the particular confident swagger of a man who had spent a year believing an inheritance nearly settled, and did not appreciate finding it complicated. "Uncle Ambrose," Caspar said, sweeping into the sick room with his hat still on, "I came the moment I heard the news. Married, and to a woman none of us have ever laid eyes on before. I confess I'm concerned for you, given your condition, that such a hasty arrangement mightn't have been entirely wise." "I'm considerably improved since the arrangement, Caspar," Ambrose said, dry. "Perhaps you ought to consider that before you finish measuring my drapes." Caspar's smile thinned, and he turned it, calculating, toward Grace. "Mrs. Wexley, I don't doubt your intentions are entirely honorable, but you'll forgive a concerned nephew for wondering exactly what a woman with $11 to her name and a foreclosed farm stands to gain from marrying a dying man, beyond the obvious." "I stand to gain a great deal, Mr. Wexley," Grace said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Chiefly the satisfaction of watching your uncle outlive every prediction you've been counting on, and the further satisfaction of watching your face when he does. If you've come to inquire after his health out of genuine family feeling, I'd welcome your help nursing him. If you've come only to guard your inheritance, I'd ask you to state your business plainly and be on your way." Caspar did not state his business plainly, that day or in any of the visits that followed, but he did not leave Lone Pine's affairs alone either, riding into town within the week to plant careful, poisonous seeds among the very people whose good opinion Grace would need, if she meant to keep any peace at all. A word here about a fortune-hunting bride. A suggestion there, that a woman who nursed a dying man so devotedly might have reasons of her own for wanting him neither fully recovered nor swiftly dead, but lingering, dependent, and entirely under her control. The whispers reached Grace slowly, the way such things always did, in the sideways glances of the mercantile clerk, and the sudden silence that fell over 2 women at the dry goods counter when she walked in to buy fresh linen. And she understood, with a grim, weary clarity, that Caspar Wexley had found a weapon considerably more effective than any legal challenge. A town's readiness to believe the worst of a stranger who had married conveniently into a dying man's fortune. It came to a head one Saturday at the Mercantile, when Mrs. Undine Pratt, the banker's wife and a woman whose opinion carried considerable weight among the town's better families, remarked to her companion in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to carry, "I do wonder how a woman nurses a dying man so devotedly for months on end, unless she's found the arrangement suits her rather better prolonged than concluded." Grace set down the bolt of linen she'd been examining and turned to face the woman directly, her voice even though her hands had gone tight at her sides. "Mrs. Pratt," she said, "I nurse my husband because I made him a vow, and because I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I have grown to care for him considerably beyond the terms of our original arrangement. If you doubt the sincerity of either fact, you are welcome to ride out to Lone Pine and sit a single one of the nights I sit, and judge for yourself whether prolonging a man's suffering could possibly serve any purpose worth the exhaustion of it. I suspect you would not last past midnight, and I mean that as no insult, only as plain fact. Mrs. Pratt had no ready answer for that, and though the whispers did not vanish overnight, they thinned considerably in the weeks that followed, and one unexpected ally emerged from the encounter in the shape of Hester Combs, the mercantile clerk's wife, who sought Grace out privately the following week to say, low and a little ashamed, that her own mother had died of a similar failing heart years before, tended by a hired nurse who had done considerably less than Grace was reported to be doing, and that she, for one, did not believe a word Caspar Wexley had been spreading. He's been in the saloon most evenings talking up his uncle's failing health like a man placing bets, Hester confided. It struck me as unseemly even before I heard your side of it. I thought you ought to know not everyone in this town has swallowed his version whole. Thank you, Hester, Grace said, and found the small kindness worth considerably more to her in that difficult season than she would have expected a stranger's good opinion to be worth to anyone. She said nothing of it to Ambrose at first, not wanting to burden a man already fighting for every breath with a fight he was in no state to help her wage. But he noticed anyway, the way he had begun noticing most things about her in the weeks since the wedding, and pressed her gently until she told him the whole of it one evening, sitting at his bedside with her mending forgotten in her lap. Caspar was always a small man dressed up in a large man's ambitions, Ambrose said, when she'd finished. I should have seen this coming and warned you properly before the wedding rather than after. I'm sorry for it. I don't need your apology, Grace said. I need only for you to keep breathing long enough to tell the whole county to his face exactly what you think of his ambitions. I find I've grown rather attached to the notion of watching that particular conversation happen. Then I suppose I'd better keep breathing, Ambrose said, and reached for her hand with a strength that surprised them both, and held it a long moment in silence that said, more plainly than either of them was yet willing to speak aloud, that the arrangement between them had become something neither of them had bargained for at the altar. Dr. Alderson's 6-week prediction came and went, and Ambrose was, by every measure Grace kept in her careful ledger, stronger than he had been at the wedding, sitting up unassisted, taking short walks to the porch on good afternoons, laughing, actually laughing, a sound she had not heard from him in the first difficult weeks, at some dry observation of his own making. I don't understand it, Alderson admitted, on one of his regular visits, listening to Ambrose's chest with an expression caught somewhere between professional bewilderment and genuine gladness. By every rule I know, this man ought to have been buried a month ago. I'll not pretend to explain it beyond saying that whatever you're doing, Mrs. Wexley, keep doing it. I'm only refusing to let him quit, Grace said. The body follows where the will leads it, more often than doctors like to admit. I learned that nursing my own father, though it didn't save him in the end. I mean to prove it can, given the right patient and enough stubbornness. On the first afternoon, Ambrose felt well enough to sit a full hour on the porch without tiring. He asked Grace to bring out the old ledger books his father had kept when Lone Pine was first homesteaded, and spent the better part of that hour telling her, in a voice gaining strength by the sentence, the whole slow history of the ranch. The drought that had nearly broken his father's resolved the second year. The winter his mother had died, and he'd nearly sold the whole place rather than face it alone. The stubborn, patient work of building a herd, worth the name from almost nothing. I never expected to have anyone left to tell this to, Ambrose admitted, watching her trace one weathered page with careful fingers. I'd made my peace with dying the last man who remembered any of it firsthand. I find I'm considerably gladder than I expected to be wrong about that. I want to know all of it, Grace said, and meant it, surprising herself with the depth of her own wanting. Not because it's mine to inherit, though I suppose it will be, but because I find I want to know the whole of the man I married, not only the patient I'm nursing. He looked at her then with an expression that held nothing at all of the resigned, dying stranger she'd married 5 weeks before, and reached for her hand across the ledger with a steadiness that surprised them both. And neither of them said anything further for a long while, content simply to sit together in the gold afternoon light, with the whole slow history of Lone Pine spread open between them. It became, after that afternoon, a habit between them. Ambrose teaching her the names of the cattle brands and the boundaries of the land, and the small, particular joys of a ranching life she had never before had occasion to learn, and Grace listening with an attention that had stopped, weeks before, being merely dutiful. She found herself, some evenings, forgetting entirely to measure his color or count his breaths, simply enjoying his company the way she might have enjoyed any good husband's, before some fresh spell of coughing would remind her, sharply, of exactly how fragile the whole arrangement still was. Caspar Wexley, watching his uncle's health improve week by week with an expression of open dismay, he no longer troubled to hide entirely, changed his tactics as the autumn deepened, and it was Grace who discovered, quite by accident, exactly how far he was prepared to go to reverse a recovery that had cost him a fortune he'd already begun, quietly, to spend against. She found him one evening in the small pantry off the kitchen where Ambrose's tonics were kept. A bottle of the digitalis tincture Alderson had prescribed for the worst of his heart trouble held up to the lamplight, examining it with a care that had nothing to do with a nephew's innocent concern. "That medicine is measured carefully to a dose Dr. Alderson said exactly," Grace said, from the doorway, her voice gone very still. "What business have you handling it, Caspar?" Caspar set the bottle down too quickly, his composure cracking for the first time since he'd ridden onto Lone Pine land. "Merely curious what my uncle's taking," he said. "A nephew's concern, nothing more." "You'll forgive me if I find that considerably less than believable," Grace said, "given how carefully you set that bottle back exactly where you found it, the moment you heard my step. I intend to have Dr. Alderson count every dose in this house from this evening forward, Caspar, and I intend to mention plainly to him, and to the sheriff both, that I found you handling it unsupervised. Should your uncle take one unexplained turn for the worse from this night on, you may expect considerably more than gossip to follow you." Caspar left Lone Pine that night without further pretense at cordiality, and though Grace could prove nothing outright, no dose had yet been altered, so far as her careful counting and Alderson's confirming visit the next morning could determine. She understood that she had only interrupted a scheme still forming, not ended it, and she began, from that night forward, locking every medicine in the house behind a cabinet only she and Alderson held keys to, and sitting up later into each night than her own exhaustion much preferred. She told Ambrose the whole of it the next morning, watching his face harden into something she had not yet seen there, not even during Caspar's earlier visits. "I built this ranch up from nothing alongside my father," Ambrose said low, "and I'll be damned before I let his grandson tear it down out of pure, grasping impatience. You did right, locking that cabinet, Grace. I only wish you'd woken me the moment you found him at it, rather than facing him down alone." "I didn't need waking for it," Grace said. "I've faced down worse than a cornered nephew, Ambrose, though I'll own I'm glad to have you well enough now to be angry about it alongside me, rather than too weak to do anything but worry." Emmett doubled his watch over the barn and the smokehouse after that, at Ambrose's quiet instruction, and for a time the household settled into a wary, watchful peace, Casper's visits growing rarer and colder as the weeks wore on, though never quite ceasing altogether, as though he were simply waiting, patient as a man counting on time itself to do the work his tampering hadn't managed. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through poison after all, but through the plain, cruel mechanics of a failing heart pushed past its limit by a hard early frost that settled over Lone Pine in the 40th week of Grace's marriage. A cold snap severe enough to test even healthy lungs. And Ambrose woke on its first night struggling for breath in a way Grace had not seen since the earliest, worst days of her nursing. "Send for Alderson," she told the hired hand Emmett, already propping Ambrose upright and steaming the bitter herbs she'd learned, over months, worked best to ease his breathing and ride fast. "Tell him it's the worst it's been." The night that followed was, by Grace's own later reckoning, the longest of her whole life, longer even than the night her father had died, because this time she refused, with every stubborn fiber of her being, to let the ending arrive the same way. Ambrose's breath came shallow and rattling, his lips gone faintly blue in the lamplight, his pulse under her fingers thin and erratic in a way that made her own heart clench with a fear she did not let show on her face, because she had learned, nursing her father, that a patient reads a nurse's fear faster than any fever chart, and she would not let Ambrose read anything in her expression but calm, steady resolve. "Stay," she told him low, gripping his hand as she'd gripped it 100 times since the medicine cabinet confrontation with Casper, "same as you've stayed through every bad night before this one. I did not marry a dying man to watch him die properly, Ambrose Wexley. I married him to argue with his dying for as long as it takes, and I am not finished arguing yet." "Grace," he managed between labored breaths, "if this is the night—" "It is not," she said, fierce, cutting him off before the sentence could finish itself into something neither of them was ready to hear spoken aloud. "I have kept a ledger of every good hour and bad one since the day I signed that marriage paper, and I intend for tonight's entry to read like every other hard night we've fought through together, not like the last one. Now be still, and breathe the way I've taught you, and trust me to do the rest." The hours between midnight and Alderson's arrival stretched long and merciless, Grace alternating steam, and cooled cloths, and low, steady words of encouragement, refusing to let herself so much as glance at the small clock on the mantel, for fear of what its slow crawl might do to her resolve. Twice Ambrose's breathing caught and stuttered in a way that stopped her own heart cold, and twice she forced herself through it, adjusting his position, steadying his hand in hers, refusing the panic clawing at the edges of her composure any purchase at all. "You are not leaving me on the 40th night of this fight," she told him, somewhere in that black stretch of hours, her voice fierce and low. "Not after everything we've built since that first terrible night, not after the ledger and the porch afternoons, and every hour I have spent learning the whole of who you are beyond a dying man's diagnosis. I forbid it, Ambrose Wexley. You do not have my permission." Alderson arrived past midnight, breathless from a hard ride through the frost, and worked alongside her through the deepest, worst hours of the crisis, checking Ambrose's pulse and lungs with grim, methodical care, and saying little, which frightened Grace considerably more than if he had spoken plainly of his fears. And it was in the coldest part of that long night, with Ambrose's pulse thready and Alderson's own composure fraying visibly at its edges, that Emmett came pounding back up from the barn with news that unraveled the whole of Casper's scheme at last. "Found this in the barn loft, ma'am," Emmett said, holding out a small bottle Grace recognized instantly as a second stock of the digitalis tincture, hidden and unaccounted for in her careful cabinet count, along with a torn scrap of paper in Casper's own hand detailing a dosage schedule considerably heavier than anything Alderson had ever prescribed. "Found it hid up under the loose board, ma'am, where nobody'd think to look unless they were looking hard." He meant to dose him past what his heart could bear, given the right cold night to blame it on, Alderson said, grim, turning the scrap of paper over in the lamplight. This frost would have given him exactly the excuse he needed. "Had you not locked that cabinet 3 weeks back, Mrs. Wexley, I don't believe we'd be having this conversation at all. You may well have saved his life twice over already, without either of us fully realizing it at the time." Grace did not have leisure, in that terrible hour, to spend on fury at Casper Wexley, not with Ambrose's breath still ragged and uncertain beneath her hands, and she turned back to her patient with a ferocity that had, by then, burned clean through exhaustion into something closer to raw, unbending will. "You hear that?" she told Ambrose, low and fierce, close to his ear so he need not strain to catch the words. "Your nephew tried to finish what this frost is attempting honestly, and failed, because I would not let him, and I will not let this cold finish it either. You are going to breathe through this, Ambrose, 1 hour at a time, because I have not gone through 5 months of arguing with your dying only to lose the argument on the 40th night to a scheming nephew's cowardice and an early frost. Stay with me." Whether it was the steam, or the steady discipline of her care, or simply the stubborn will she had poured into him hour after hour for 5 months running, Ambrose's breath began, near the blackest hour before dawn, to ease by degrees, his color creeping back by fractions, his pulse under her fingers steadying into something Alderson, checking it for the 3rd time that hour, finally pronounced improving rather than failing. Dawn found him sleeping, properly sleeping, his breath even and unlabored for the first time since the frost had struck, and Grace sat beside him with Emmett's damning bottle and scrap of paper still clutched in her other hand, and felt the whole weight of the night's terror finally, slowly, begin to loosen its grip on her chest. Sheriff Purnell rode out from town himself once Alderson's account of the hidden tincture and its accompanying dosage schedule reached him, and Casper Wexley, confronted with evidence he could not talk his way around, offered no defense beyond a bitter, cornered confession that he had grown tired of watching an inheritance he'd already spent, in his own mind, slip further away with every week his uncle's health improved, and had decided the frost would give him the perfect, unprovable opportunity to hurry along what he'd convinced himself was inevitable regardless. "You'd have killed your own uncle," Grace said, standing in the yard as the sheriff secured Casper's hands, "for land you never once helped tend, from a man you never once troubled yourself to nurse through a single hard night, while I sat up 40 of them keeping him alive out of nothing more than plain, stubborn refusal to let him die on schedule." "He was dying anyway," Casper said, sullen. "I only meant to hasten the inevitable." "He is not dying," Grace said, "and has not been for some months now, a fact you'd have known had you spent even one of those months at his bedside instead of counting his acreage from a distance. Take him away, Sheriff. I've a husband inside who needs his breakfast, and I find I've lost all patience for further conversation with a man who tried to murder him." Casper Wexley left the county entirely within the month, his reputation ruined past any repair the town was willing to offer, and Lone Pine's opinion of Grace Wexley turned, in the weeks that followed, from suspicious whispers about a fortune-hunting bride to open, admiring talk of the woman who had fought off both a failing heart and a scheming nephew to keep her husband alive. A reversal so complete that the same mercantile clerk who had once gone silent at her approach now greeted her by name and asked, with genuine warmth, after Ambrose's health each time she came to town. Mrs. Undine Pratt herself called at Lone Pine before the winter was out, stiff with the particular discomfort of a proud woman owning an error, to offer an apology Grace accepted with more grace than the woman likely expected. And Hester Combs became, in the months that followed, as steady a friend as Grace had found anywhere in her adult life. The two of them trading remedies and small kindnesses, with the easy familiarity of women who had recognized something true in each other during a hard season neither had chosen. "I nearly believed the worst of you myself before I knew you," Hester admitted once, over tea in Grace's own kitchen. "It's a humbling thing, watching a whole town's opinion turn on the strength of one greedy man's lies, and a comfort besides, watching it turn back just as surely once the truth got loose." "Truth generally does get loose, given enough stubbornness to carry it," Grace said, "though I'll own it took considerably more of that stubbornness than I had any right to expect I'd need." Ambrose recovered through the winter with a steadiness that even Alderson, cautious by professional habit, eventually admitted looked less like remission and more like plain, thorough healing. And by the time the first green showed on Lone Pines fields the following spring, he was walking its full length unassisted, working alongside his hands, with an endurance that would have seemed impossible to the gray, dying man Grace had married a year before. He found her one evening in that first full spring, sitting on the porch step with her ledger open on her knees, the careful record of good hours and bad ones that had once tracked his survival hour by desperate hour now filled, page after page, with nothing more dramatic than ordinary, healthy days. "You still keep that ledger," he said, settling beside her with none of the labored caution that had marked his every movement a year before. "I've grown fond of the habit," Grace said, "though I'll own the entries have gotten considerably more boring to write, which I consider the finest possible outcome for both of us." "I married you for convenience," Ambrose said, taking the ledger gently from her hands and setting it aside, "because I was dying and wanted my land safe and my last days decent rather than lonely. I did not marry you expecting to fall in love with the woman doing the nursing, and I did not expect, least of all, to still be sitting on this porch a year later, healthy enough to tell you so properly." "I married you for your land," Grace said, "because I had $11 and no better offer in the world. I did not expect, either, to spend 5 months fighting for a stranger's life with everything I had in me, only to discover, somewhere in the fighting, that I'd stopped doing it for the land entirely." "Then I suppose," Ambrose said, taking her hand the way he had on so many hard nights before, though this time with nothing at all fragile in his grip, "we ought to make the arrangement considerably less convenient and considerably more permanent, by whatever measure a heart uses to reckon such things properly." "I believe," Grace said, "that arrangement was settled some months back, somewhere around the 40th night, though neither of us troubled to say so plainly until just now." "Then let this be the plain saying of it," Ambrose said, and kissed her there on the porch step in the low gold light of a spring evening, with Lone Pines fields greening around them and the whole hard, frightening winter finally, fully behind them, and Grace Wexley, who had come to this ranch with $11 and a stranger's dying hand to nurse, understood that she had won, in the end, considerably more than the land she'd bargained for. She had won a whole life, hard-fought and fiercely kept, with a man she had refused, 40 nights running, to let go.